Stop me if you've heard this story before. A cult-like religious figure enters the lives of the ruling family of a prominent country during a period of intense grief. Not as an official advisor, more as a spiritual guide. And this relationship starts off as harmless. Perhaps it's even a necessary therapeutic outlet for a family member who's already in a stressful position. And over time, this relationship gets tighter, which provides greater access for the religious figure. Soon, the person in charge begins to push official government and political advisors away. The nation's power and framework of authority are being bypassed. Shamanistic rituals and seances start to take place inside the walls of the most powerful building in the country. Then, before anyone realizes it, the spiritual guide isn't just shaping policy that affects millions of people, they're calling the shots. And at this point, you're probably yelling out Rasputin, like this is Jeopardy, and the topic is shadow puppeteers of world leaders. Although that would be dumb because I can't hear you, and this isn't Jeopardy. Admittedly, you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but this is a different version of that probably familiar story. And if you stick around long enough, you'll see just how different and insane this version truly is. Almost exactly 1 century after Rasputin's relationship with Tsarina Alexandra ended in a bloodbath. And unlike the Rasputin story, this didn't happen in Imperial Russia during the last breaths of a crumbling monarchy. It doesn't end with a wild assassination that includes poison, gunshots, and Bolshevik revolution. No, this version happened in South Korea. And the fallout from these events involves corporate money trials, coerced donations, and several high-ranking executives of some of the largest tech companies in the world, defending themselves in court from everything that went down. The scandal left the entire nation of South Korea in political turmoil for months, while its citizens flooded the streets in the largest public protest in the country's short history. If this was Jeopardy, then the answer would be this person was the shaman advisor to the president of South Korea, whose rise and fall bore striking similarity to Rasputin. And the correct answer would be Choi Sun-shil. Or, if it was Jeopardy, it would be who is Choi Sun-shil. But perhaps an even more relevant question would be, how is a private citizen able to turn South Korea, a modern-day democratic nation with the 14th largest GDP, into a theocracy, almost completely from the shadows? To answer that, we have to ask one last question. Who is Park Geun-hye? Well, Ms. Park was South Korea's first female head of state. Her scandal was a watershed moment for South Korea. It exposed deep-rooted problems in their young democracy, which had only just begun in 1987 after decades of authoritarian military rule. The nation vowed never to find themselves in that position ever again. So when Park's partnership with Choi, or alliance, or whatever term someone uses for a puppet-puppeteer relationship, I guess that would be what you would call it, came to light, Park also earned the distinction of becoming the nation's first democratically elected leader to be forced out of office in disgrace. Ultimately, in a refreshing display of checks and balances, Park was charged, found guilty, and actually imprisoned briefly. But this story is much more complicated than the news reports. It was decades in the making. And to understand it, we have to start at the beginning. Quite literally, at the beginning of South Korea. So hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about the scandal of South Korea's secret ruler. This story was a big deal in 2016, but I guarantee there's a lot of my English listeners who have never even heard of this before. It would probably be best if you were hearing about it from the first time, from someone who is not an Appalachian boy who is going to butcher the pronunciation of a lot of these names, but hey, it's too late for that now. This story is fascinating. It's a narrative straight out of the Dark Ages that most of us would think couldn't even happen nowadays. Sure enough, as was made very public, for a while South Korea was in the hands of an obscure religious shaman. It's a story that I'm excited to talk about, and hopefully you're excited to hear about. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the Park Geun-hye scandal. Life can be stressful, so taking care of yourself, especially what you eat, can't always be easy. But now it's easier than ever thanks to today's sponsor, Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted, and dietitian-approved meals straight to your door. Their meals are ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. It takes out the prep work and the cleanup so you can focus on eating something that you enjoy that's also good for you. Factor has over 100 options every week, from their meals to their salads to their shakes to their breakfasts, and their meals are made without ingredients like refined seed oils or refined sugars, and instead packs on the things you need, like a balanced diet of carbohydrates, healthy fats, and protein. A lot of the times we have to pick between our meals being something that we enjoy while we're eating it or are glad we ate after we ate it. Thankfully with Factor, you get both as well as convenience. So if you want to get in on Factor, then now's the perfect time. That's because if you head to the link in the description at factor75.com or click the link below and use code WENDIGANGFB50, you'll get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for a year. That's right, half off your first box and free breakfast for a year while your subscription lasts. Again, that's code WENDIGANGFB50 at factor75.com to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you to Factor for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So, South Korea was born in 1948. The Korean Peninsula was split up after World War II. Park Geun-hye was born in 1952, and Park's father, Park Chung-hee, led a militant coup in 1961. Those decades of authoritarian military rule that I referenced earlier, that was basically all started by the Park family. I mean, there were more people involved, but they were the face of it. While the country was still rebuilding itself from the Korean War, or 625 as they call it, the elder Park rose through the military ranks quickly. He became chief of the operations staff of the South Korean Army and deputy commander of the Second Army. Then, in the early hours of May 16, 1961, Park marched thousands of his loyal troops into Seoul, the nation's capital, and forced his way into office. Depending on who you ask, he was either a brutal authoritarian who crushed dissent, or he was the architect of the country's rapid industrialization. To many people, he was both at the same time, so it's probably no big surprise that multiple vigilante-led efforts were made to remove the dictator from office, or, in other words, assassination attempts. I'm not South Korean, I'm not that familiar with his rule, this may be completely out of place to say, but I just want to add that this picture of him goes pretty hard. I mean, look at that jacket and the glasses. I just wanted us all to see that. One of those assassination attempts was in 1974, when a pro-North Korean agent took aim at President Park during a Liberation Day ceremony in Seoul. But the would-be assassin botched the shot. Instead, he accidentally shot the First Lady, Yak Young-soo, in the head. In the blink of an eye, Park Geun-hye had lost her mother in devastating fashion. That reminds me a bit of when Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. According to Gavrilo, he jumped on the back of the car to shoot the Archduke, but as he aimed his pistol, his wife Sophia laid over him. So Gavrilo accidentally shot her before killing the Archduke. According to him, this was the reason he wasn't able to take his own life, because he was so shattered by the fact that he had shot a woman. Obviously, a murder is a murder, but there's something especially tragic when the people who were killed aren't even the ones who were being targeted. Geun-hye was only 22 years old at the time of her mother's murder, but was still called on to be acting First Lady. Not because she was ready or willing, but because her father said the regime needed her to be. This is important to understand. Park Geun-hye didn't step into power gradually. She was dropped into it during trauma. Not just any trauma, quite possibly one of the worst possible things that could ever happen to a daughter. Overnight, Park's life became tightly controlled. She had to be on at all times. She had to stand next to her father at ceremonies. She had to host events. What she didn't have was time to grieve. While the public saw a composed, quiet, even stoic young woman on the outside, one could only guess what was happening emotionally on the inside. So, enter a man named Choi Tae-min. He had an idea, and he also knew how he could exploit it. Choi Tae-min was once a Buddhist monk, but he always wanted more. In this way, I guess he and Chung-hee, Park's father, who became president, were the same in terms of unbridled ambitions. Buddhism doesn't necessarily teach that having an ego is forbidden. Buddhists, especially monks, approach ego like some do addiction. You acknowledge it, accept it, and then try to actively move yourself away from it. But not Choi. He leaned into his ego. He declared himself Maitreya, or a future Buddha. I'm certainly no expert, but declaring yourself a demigod feels somewhat antithetical to the whole Buddhism thing. So Choi left the monkhood to set up his own spiritual group. He called it Youngsae-gyo, or the Church of Eternal Life. See, all the time in the United States, we read about these weird offshoot Christian groups that start their own fragment churches and start doing weird things like being a doomsday cult or just killing people. So it's nice to know that that happens everywhere. It's not just us. His church combined the tenets of Buddhism along with Christianity. And dang it, there it is. Somehow we had something to do with it. And Korea's indigenous Confucian shamanic movement, Chundoism. All of this to say, he was more or less just kind of making up his own rules in a muddled and confusing amalgamation of several different religious virtues. As a result, Choi was generally known as a shaman-esque cult leader, and his calling was to help the president's daughter, Park Geun-hye, grieve her mother. The Korean news publication Hangyo-rae interviewed a minister who knew Choi. According to this minister, Choi was praying in a cave one day when he claimed to have met the spirit of the First Lady, Yuk Young-soo. In other words, he claims to have met the spirit of Park's dead mother. She was, as Choi put it, quote, sitting on a boulder with her skirt spread out as the morning sunlight streamed down. The minister continued by saying that this spirit of the First Lady told Choi that her daughter had been in trouble since her death. If Choi could help Park Geun-hye grieve, he would heal the entire nation of South Korea. Choi was to write a letter to Young-soo's daughter to arrange a meeting. Then, the spirit revealed a secret to Choi that only mother and daughter had known. After that, Choi said he got a phone call from the Blue House, which is the South Korean version of the White House. When Choi met Park Geun-hye and told her the secret about her mother, Park fainted. In the trance, Park met her mother, who apparently told her she had sent Choi to help her out. Since that time, Park completely trusted Choi. Whatever this secret was, it was enough to convince Park that her dead mother had sent this shaman to help her. So from that moment on, Choi became an emotional anchor to Park. She started attending his masses regularly. She also began to see him as something of a mentor. He made sure to keep her close by naming her president of one of his church's initiatives called the New Heart Volunteer Group. He also helped her run another pro-government volunteer group called Movement for a New Mind. And although we don't have the specific or perhaps salacious details of their relationship, a WikiLeaks diplomatic cable between the US and South Korea governments reportedly contained rumors that Choi was a, quote, Korean Rasputin, who, quote, had complete control over Park's body and soul during her formative years. Which, if those leaks are to be believed, their relationship was troubling to say the least. Cable also mentions that Choi's children, quote, accumulated enormous wealth as a result of this relationship. But President Park Chung-hee, Park's father, wasn't completely blind to all of this. When he first took office in 1961, Park established the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, or the KCIA. See, isn't that cute? It's like pop. Like we have pop, so Korea has K-pop. We have the CIA, so they have the KCIA. I wonder if the KCIA killed their version of Kennedy. His name already starts with a K, so maybe. He essentially leveraged the agency to spy on and suppress any domestic opposition to his regime, and also used it to question Choi in 1977 after reports of corruption. Whether or not they found any dirt on Choi didn't matter. The young Geun-hye's staunch defense of spiritual mentor was enough to get President Park to drop the investigation altogether with zero consequences. Ultimately, he was just kind of blind to the relationship his daughter was carrying on with a man 40 years older than her. Then, tragedy struck again for Park Geun-hye. In 1979, someone opened fire at her father in another public assassination attempt. This time, the call came from inside of the house. It was a KCIA agent. Well, I guess that answers my question about the whole Kennedy thing. Not just any KCIA agent, this man was the director of the agency, Kim Jae-gyo. And this time, the bullet didn't miss. Director Kim shouted, "Insolent," moments before he shot the president twice in the chest, once in the stomach, and then a final shot to the head, execution style. After 18 years of ruling South Korea, the Park family was no longer in power. According to his appeal, Kim testified that one of his motivations for assassinating President Park was his inaction against the obviously corrupt Choi. So enough people around Choi were suspicious of his relationship with the Park family, to the degree that the director of the CIA, or the KCIA, saw it as part of his justification for killing the president. Park Geun-hye lost both of her parents to 2 separate assassinations and was now relieved from any First Lady duties. She would largely stay out of the public eye for most of the 80s and 90s. But that didn't mean that the Park-Choi relationship would come to an end. Quite the opposite, actually. For a lot of people, religion plays an important role during grief. They can provide community, structure, and even assign meaning to the grief, making it possible to process. Unfortunately, some of history's biggest monsters knew that people in mourning are more likely to suspend their skepticism in favor of finding that meaning. That's why cult leaders target widows, televangelists target disaster survivors, and why doomsday prophets target the uneducated and the downtrodden. And it's also why Park Geun-hye's relationship with Choi only strengthened after this tragedy. The trauma forced onto Park Geun-hye was unimaginable. She was vulnerable. Her life was chaos, and it needed structure. Choi became a stand-in father figure, and in a way, he adopted her into his family. And this is where Park would come to befriend the Choi daughters. But a man like Choi isn't the kind to do favors from the goodness of his own heart. The grieving services he rendered to Park were, at best, transactional. At worst, Choi was exploiting a young woman, both sexually, possibly, and financially, after her parents were publicly and brutally murdered. This is summed up best by the letter that the younger Park daughter, Park Geun-ryeong, wrote to the new occupants of the Blue House in 1986. Before the First Lady Yuk Young-soo died in 1974, she set up a non-profit foundation to help South Korean children in need. It became the late First Lady's lasting legacy. In her letter, Geun-ryeong tried to alert the government that the Chois were siphoning money from the foundation. She also asserted that Choi had some sort of Stockholm Syndrome-like hold on her older sister. Quote, "Choi is a crook and he should be sternly punished, and my sister Park Geun-hye should be saved from his capture." The letter fell on deaf ears. Perhaps the new administration still held a grudge against the Park family, since, it was their father that had the whole dictatorship, allegedly, to some people, thing going on. Or it was just a letter that was sent, so maybe nobody actually saw it. Either way, in the end, the most powerful office in the land did nothing with this information. People were trying to help Park Geun-hye, a young lady who almost certainly suffered from stunned emotional development. The adults in the room just weren't listening. Nearly a decade passed, and the Choi-Park relationship solidified even further. Young likely thought her sister caught a break when in 1994, at the age of 81, Choi Tae-min died. So you'd think that was the end of the story, right? You would think that the guy who Park had the relationship with dying meant that this predatory relationship was over. And yes, you would think that, wouldn't you? But look at the timestamp of this video. Not even close. The Park-Choi relationship didn't just have a habit of fighting its way through death, it thrived on death. I mean, that's how we got here in the first place with the death of Park's mother. It was trauma bonding to an extreme degree. So enter Choi Tae-min's daughter, Choi Sun-shil. Sun-shil was Tae-min's fifth daughter and would take after her father in numerous ways, namely, her penchant for spiritual manipulation. Sun-shil was close in age to Park Geun-hye, being only 3 years younger. The two young women had first met at the New Heart Initiative in the late 70s, and after Choi Tae-min named Park Geun-hye president of the group, he made his own daughter the student president. Sun-shil became sort of a confidant for Geun-hye after her father's assassination. As Miss Park herself would later summarize their connection, Choi Sun-shil, quote, "stood with me during the hardest moment in my life. Now they could bond over the feelings of losing a father, although the two circumstances were wildly different. But Sun-shil proved to be more of an extension of her father rather than an actual friend looking for empathy. She carried on his Rasputin-esque ways, having learned a great deal from her father. Sun-shil started small, first by making simple, everyday decisions for Park, like her outfits and choice of handbag. Much of this was under the guise of spirituality. If you wear this color on this day, it will bring you fortune, or blah blah blah, something like that. As any seasoned gaslighter would attest, manipulating someone on a small scale over and over eventually leads to bigger opportunities. And in the late 90s, Park Geun-hye followed in her father's footsteps by deciding to resume the family business of South Korean politics. No, unlike her father, she did not organize a coup. Instead, she actually observed the democratic process, ran for office, and was elected to a seat in parliament with a, quote, vow to save the country as it suffered through the Asian financial crisis. And the whole time, Choi Sun-shil was right by her side. For all we know, running for election might have been her idea, but speculation on that is unsubstantiated, if in character. Regardless, Park was now back in the public eye. Perhaps foreseeing the scrutiny that would come with Park's newfound publicity, Choi made a conscious effort to remain in darkness. She never received an official title, but embedded herself in Park's political and social circles where she would operate quietly behind the scenes. Park and Choi were like the Simon and Garfunkel, the Kobe and Shaq, the Shatner and Amoy of South Korean politics. Wow, can you tell that the person who writes my scripts is like 57? That's such a mean line. Greg's not even close to 57. I'm sorry, Greg. Together, the two of them found success, rising through the ranks quickly. But behind the success, the relationship was completely dysfunctional. Park clearly had an unhealthy dependency on Choi, which led to Choi having, as reports would eventually call it, quote, inappropriate access to Park. Whatever you want to mean by that. For example, Park's political team would give Choi reports on schedules and speeches regarding Korean state matters. Choi was even tracking Park's personnel arrangements. While not especially egregious for lower status politicians, it also was not a good look, and would likely have been called into question had it been more widely known. I mean, imagine if nowadays the president just handed his friend a piece of paper that says who the personnel will be, where they'll be, what the security is for everything. It's easy to see how people around Park did not like how she was treating Choi. But as Park navigated her way to the top of the South Korean Conservative Party, Choi seemingly hid even deeper within the shadows. Both women engaged in efforts to keep their relationship hidden, including from Park's closest political aides. Meanwhile, Choi's role in access got bigger. Choi became privy to a series of confidential state affairs, and even gained access to classified information on secret meetings with North Korea. North and South Korea were, and are still, this geopolitical relationship ebbs and flows, and it's tenuous and fragile. For a non-elected, non-official civilian to have such access was beyond the pale, and it would eventually prove dangerous to the country as a whole. As her access grew, Choi's influence on Park also grew bigger. It evolved from decisions on wardrobe and handbags to public statements and speeches. Speeches don't necessarily dictate national policy, but they can shape public sentiments and have tangible, wide-reaching ramifications. Think Abe Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address, or JFK's inauguration in 1961, or Reagan's address in West Berlin. So Choi having the power to influence, and at times writing drafts, of Park's speeches was a big deal. That meant that Choi wasn't just manipulating Park, she was influencing the people of South Korea, the people who had elected Park to office, not Choi. It also meant that Choi had the ability to bend policy in a way that would benefit herself, her church, and her bank account. There's a chance that if Park and Choi had stopped there, everything, their relationship, the greed, the corruption, would have remained in the dark. I mean, so many elected leaders in different countries can kind of get away with some things as long as they're not in the spotlight. But ego would come into play, just as it had for Choi's father, and ambition would get the better of both, leading to their eventual downfall. In 2012, Park Geun-hye, now the most powerful and popular member of the main Conservative Party, ran for president of South Korea. And that December, she won. She defeated her opponent, Moon Jae-in, by a slim margin, 52% of the vote to his 48. A few months later, she was sworn in, quote, promising an era of hope. So, once again, a Park was back in the highest office in the land. Only this time, she didn't have to have a coup for it. Also, unlike her father, Miss Park lacked the same conviction. For better or worse, Chung-hee had a vision and a determination to execute. Miss Park, on the other hand, was never truly running the show. This isn't necessarily a defense of Park Geun-hye. At one point, you are responsible for your own actions, especially if those actions are dictating a whole country, but it is true that she grew up in a bubble, and a highly fortified one at that. She may have never had a grip on reality in terms of how the world works outside of wealth and politics, and thus was never really a woman of the people. She became the epitome of a figurehead, with someone doing her job for her while she smiled and waved. Most high-ranking politicians are visible public figures, but nothing compares to the visibility of the presidency. Smiling and waving wouldn't be enough for this office, and once all eyes and ears turned towards the new President Park, she floundered. Her grip on reality, or lack thereof, became evident. Sometimes it seemed like she didn't want to be there, and sometimes she wasn't. In April of 2014, a ferry that was en route from Incheon to Jeju City capsized. It was carrying heavy cargo, and when it made a corrective maneuver, the containers, cars, and whatever else it was carrying tilted to one side. The ship lost stability and sank into the freezing water. But the ferry wasn't only carrying cargo, it had 476 passengers, most of whom were teachers and high school students on a field trip. And tragically, 304 of those passengers died in what was deemed the country's worst disaster in decades, largely due to the fact that South Korean Coast Guard took several hours to arrive. Accidents happen, negligence happens, but for something of this scale, especially when a government entity like the Coast Guard's involved, the people look to see how leadership responds. But Park Geun-hye could not be found. Here's the timeline. The first distress signal was sent at 8:58 a.m. The Blue House and Park's administration didn't notice the signal until 9:19 a.m. The South Korean Crisis Management Center completed its first situation report at 9:57 a.m. So an hour had passed at this point when literally every second mattered because the Coast Guard could not act without Park's approval. At 10:12 a.m., this report was sent to President Park along with a phone call. Both went unanswered. And where was she, you may ask? Well, Park Geun-hye was in her bedroom and couldn't be bothered. So the news that hundreds of people, including school children, were drowning in freezing water was left on a table outside of her room. 20 minutes later, about an hour and a half after the first call of distress, Park emerged from her room to be debriefed. And then the Coast Guard got the okay to attempt a rescue mission. 7 hours later, yes, 7, after more than 300 people died in freezing South Korean waters because of her inaction, President Park finally showed her face to express her condolences about the tragedy. As I could imagine, as you could imagine, as I'm sure most people could imagine, this didn't do anything to appease the public. The damage had been done. She had shown what kind of leader she was. Barely a year into her 5-year term, citizens were already calling for her resignation. Some marched to her office in the Blue House to, as the New York Times put it, quote, demand an inquiry into allegations that a tardy and bumbling response by her government drastically increased the number of deaths in this disaster. Park listened, or at least it seemed like she did. She didn't resign, but a month later made a televised statement about the government's slow response to the accident. She actually seemed genuinely remorseful, and in a tearful apology, she took responsibility, saying that the nation deserved a president, quote, who should have been responsible for the safety and lives of the people. She also said she would create a new government agency to handle large-scale accidents for faster responses. Which, yeah, is easy to say for the president that helped contribute to the deaths of 300 people. Be a lot harder to say from one of the victims or family members of the victims. But also, not that this gives Park any freedom or wiggle room in what she did, but why is the system set up that the Coast Guard can't go do a rescue without presidential approval? I understand things are tense with North Korea. You don't want to send out military adjacent vessels out into open waters. I get that. But I mean, there's not a middleman you can call who can kind of send out a distress signal to be like, hey, we're just getting our guys, not trying to move a nuke into North Korea. I don't know, it seems like a dumb oversight. But again, probably would have went fine if it wasn't for the dumb oversight named Park. But behind the scenes, Park and Choi had ulterior motives. Rather than taking one on the chin and learning from her mistakes, President Park instead kickstarted her censorship era. The Blue House put together a commission to monitor and prosecute Park's critics. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what her father did when he created the KCIA, a move more fitting of an autocracy than a democracy. And in a stunning mirror of family history, as Choi's son Shil took the reins from her father, Park started turning into hers. One journalist in particular was the primary target of the commission. He wasn't even a critic, just doing his job by reporting that President Park responded to the ferry crash and unfolding disaster by first meeting with, quote, fringe leader Choi's son Shil. So all this reporter did is just state a fact. Before meeting with other leaders after the ferry crash, Park met with Choi. For this, the administration charged the reporter with defamation, presumably upset at having this secret relationship called out to such a large audience. But in 2018, investigative documents looking into the government's immediate response to the crash would side with the reporter. Park, they found, did indeed spend, quote, crucial early hours in her bedroom. Then she would meet with Choi before making any kind of decision on a response. However, The most upsetting detail uncovered by the investigation was that Park, and I'm not kidding, got her hair done during this time. That's right. Without exaggeration, as children were drowning, she was getting a blowout. And keep in mind, I'm not saying she got her hair done before the press conference several hours later. She got her hair done before telling the Coast Guard that they could go save the drowning children. The investigation also found that Park had had her aides manipulate the actual timeline to cover up what she was really doing during that time. Park had another bizarre response to the fallout of the ferry tragedy. Barely a month after the 2014 accident, she and Choi created a kind of secret blacklist for artists who commemorated the victims in their artwork. Yeah, I'm not kidding. If a singer or a painter or someone did something for the victims of the ferry tragedy, they would no longer receive any kind of sponsorship from the government, financial or otherwise. They created a blacklist of artists who were mourning the death of children that drowned just because it was conjuring up an event that Park and Choi weren't happy with. The censorship continued for the rest of her short-lived term. Around the same time, the South Korean newspaper Sae Ilbo got a hold of a leaked internal memo from the Blue House. They published excerpts from it, which suggested that Park knew that a man named Chung Yoon-hway was in charge of a, quote, secret influence network. This was a big deal because Chung was Choi's ex-husband, meaning this was the first confirmed government official connection between Park and Choi. Essentially, Choi's ex was regularly meeting with 10 Blue House officials, including 3 of Park's senior staff, to, quote, discuss issues involving the presidential office. This is a good time to mention that there had been rumors going around that President Park and Chung were having an affair. And at least one publication asserted that Park was with this man in her bedroom during the ferry accident, although this has never been verified. Given we're in the midst of weird religious groups and manipulation, who knows what kind of love triangle octagon thing existed between Park, Choi, and Choi's ex-husband. This leaked memo seemed to have struck a nerve. Park and Choi went scorched earth on the newspaper. They deflected from the content of the memo and chose to loudly condemn the news report. The administration immediately investigated the matter as one of national security, because it's a really good idea when, as a leader, a publication speaks ill of you or says you did a thing. It's a good idea to immediately freak out and wipe them off the face of the earth and make sure anyone's scared to talk about it ever again. That normally keeps people from thinking about it. Park then pressured the CEO of the paper to step down, which he did. A clear censorship of the free press and abuse of power against the media. Again, not the kind of thing democracies promote. But as bad as all of this was, it wasn't until 2016 that things truly got bad for President Park. The beginnings of her downfall would start to take root, and it all started because of show ponies. Not a joke, not like an alliteration or a metaphor. I'm talking about actual horses. Horses used as show ponies. That is what would end up toppling this multi-generational scandal involving dictatorships and presidencies. South Korea may not be a real country. I haven't checked. An Associated Press news report from Yo Kyung Lee put it best. Quote, although the student protesters may not have intended to force out Park, experts said their movement would be remembered as the opening chapter in the political saga that ended her presidency. In the late summer of 2016, more than 3,000 students and alumni from the prestigious South Korean women's college, Ewha University, protested about something that initially had absolutely nothing to do with Park, Choi, or even the government. See, Ewha University had been working on creating a new but controversial degree program. The details of it absolutely do not matter for this video. All you need to know is that the students, unhappy with this, put forth a coordinated effort to cancel the program and for the president of Ewha University to resign. That's it. That's all this was going to be. Students and alumni were upset at the way the university was setting up the program, and they wanted the president of it to step down. But in the midst of these efforts, it was uncovered that a student named Chung Yu Ra was receiving academic favors like extremely lenient grading and being allowed to submit schoolwork super late, if at all. The students were upset with the way degrees were being handed out, and in their investigation of it, a lot of students, Chung being an example, were getting a lot of favors. This student Chung may also have been admitted to the university under special rules for sports, despite not necessarily being great at her sport. Why does any of this matter, you may ask? Well, Chung Yu-ra was Choi's daughter. That's right, otherwise completely unrelated to the presidency. One of the students who was getting a lot of favor in the midst of this protest from the university turned out to be the daughter of Choi. So people, as you could imagine, theorized that the reason she was getting favor was because of Choi's relationship to President Park. As a side note, there was a widespread belief that Chung Yu-ra was not actually Choi's daughter, but was rather the secret love child of President Park and the late Choi Tae-min, or in other words, the current Choi's father. So remember when he was like a guy 40 years older than her who was mentoring her? Well, several people believe that Choi's daughter was actually Choi's sister? Half-sister? How would that work? If your daughter has... that's just your half-sister. Yeah, it's the half-sister, but your half-sister's mom is your friend, who you're possibly in a weird love triangle with your ex-husband, and you're all elected officials. This is so gross. But again, that claim's unverified. Officially, it's Choi's daughter. At this time, Choi had been running two major nonprofit organizations that had very close ties to the presidency, and major South Korean conglomerates like, Samsung and Hyundai were donating billions of wons, or millions of dollars, to both foundations. So Choi officially isn't a government official, but she is a government official because she influences everything Park does. And Choi's daughter is getting favor at Ewha University. How does any of this connect? Well, in early October of 2016, an official investigation into the allegations regarding Chung and Ewha University revealed that Choi was using some of these nonprofits' funds for dressage lessons for her daughter. If you're not familiar, dressage, or I think it's pronounced dressage technically, is basically fancy horse dancing. And like any kind of equestrian training, it's wildly expensive. So Choi was embezzling charity funds to pay for her daughter's horse lessons. And again, this isn't a low-key charity. Like I said, Samsung and Hyundai were paying millions of US dollars into the charity, or the equivalent of millions of US dollars. You get what I mean. This led to the media looking deeper into the Park-Choi relationship. I mean, why would Choi's daughter get so much favor? There were breadcrumbs and red flags along the way, but the dam burst wide open when journalists from JTBC, quote, located a rental office in Germany which had previously been temporarily used by Choi. And inside this office was a Samsung tablet that belonged to Choi. Choi foolishly had left this tablet behind. And on it, as the journalist investigated, among other things, were the drafts of 44 presidential speeches. This was concrete evidence that Choi's son Shil, a private citizen, had unlawful access to state documents and was actively shaping Park's speeches. The fallout and downfall happened swiftly. By October 19, 2016, JTBC reported that they had anonymous sources saying Choi was editing the president's speeches, and not just for grammatical or spelling errors, but for content. On October 24th, they verified the validity of the tablet and reported that they had it in their possession, along with all classified information she had left behind. President Park tried to get ahead of it. 6 days later, on October 25th, she confirmed that she had a relationship with Choi, but downplayed it, saying Choi was, quote, acting as her unofficial, unpaid personal assistant. Shades of that are true. Choi was unofficial, and she likely wasn't paid a salary. But those large corporate donations to her nonprofits were now looking a lot more like payments. And given her previous missteps, Park wasn't afforded any kind of grace or leeway. I mean, after everything that came out with the ferry sinking, I'm sure no one's going to hear her side of the story. Within the next few days, pretty much all of South Korean media was reporting the Park-Choi relationship ran much deeper than that of a boss and personal assistant. The Hankyoreh printed a report on October 26th that was particularly damning. The newspaper interviewed Lee Sung-han, a close associate of Choi's and the Secretary General to the Mi-Ru Foundation, one of Choi's nonprofits. Over the course of several 4-hour-long interviews, Lee made some eye-opening statements. Every evening, he said, Park received a packet that contained confidential daily reports from her senior aides and secretaries. Choi was also getting these presidential packets. She was involved in high-level personnel decisions and appointment issues. She had a lot to say in who to make cabinet members and who to kick to the curb. Lee stated bluntly that the administration is, quote, actually a system where Choi tells the president to do things this way or that way. There aren't any issues where the president can decide on her own. It's basically only possible once Choi has been asked about and approves everything. All of South Korea and the rest of the world now understood who was really in charge of the country. On October 27th, state prosecutors launched a special investigation. On October 29th, people flooded the streets of Seoul in the first of several large anti-Park protest rallies. In the wake of the protest, President Park, quote, accepted the resignations of several of her senior aides and the prime minister. In other words, she fired them in an attempt to reduce the heat. Which, yeah, that's another great strategy. Just like how it was a great idea when she received criticism to threaten to blacklist and destroy anyone who talked about her, it's also a good idea if you get criticism to fire everyone. That will help. Also, look at the pictures of these protesters. This is such a cool protest. They're dressing as a puppet and puppeteer as Park and Choi. That's brilliant. How did they coordinate this? Was this like an arts and crafts project? That's why it took them 2 days after the investigation. They had to put together their costumes. As you can imagine, firing everyone didn't work. On October 30th, Choi Sun-shil, who was hiding out in Germany, returned to South Korea to turn herself in. She was arrested on, quote, suspicion of exerting inappropriate influence over state affairs. She was charged with abuse of power and attempted fraud. She didn't try to fight it. She actually told the reporters that she, quote, committed a sin that deserves death. Which, okay, alright, yeah. Blah, 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 woes me. More claims came out during the reporting and investigation. Park's past speeches were scoured and scrutinized to gather evidence against Park and Choi. In hindsight, people realized that Park had been using unusual expressions in a lot of her speeches. Unusual in the sense that it wasn't the kind of language a world leader would typically make. At times, her rhetoric was almost too spiritual in nature. For instance, quote, if you do not learn history properly, your soul will become abnormal. And if you wish earnestly, the entire universe will help you. We can see now in hindsight why this sounds more like the daughter of a shaman than a president. Under Choi's control, President Park turned a democracy into a theocracy, which is essentially a form of government where a religious figure is in charge. The Church of Eternal Life, aka the Church of Choi, also seeped into the Blue House, quite literally, as reports shared that shamanistic rituals have been taking place inside its walls. At least here in the United States, we go to some pedophile's island or ranch in New Mexico to perform our rituals like good businessmen. They were doing it right in the walls of the Blue House. That's completely unacceptable. But jokes aside, having fringe pseudoscience spiritual practices inside government buildings isn't entirely without precedent. The 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, famously had an astrologer in the White House that his wife Nancy also used on a regular basis. Unusual until you remember that Reagan was a former Hollywood actor who had spent his formative years in California. They probably had astrologers in the Union back then. But the Park Choi rituals were grander, obscure, more like the things I talk about on the other channel. They reportedly involved amulets, fortune-telling, and channeling spirits, like that of Park's deceased mother. In a televised statement on November 4th, Park denied those reports. She called them baseless rumors and speculation. However, she did finally admit that her relationship with Choi was a problem. But, in what seems like classic victim mentality, she said that the entire scandal was all her own fault and a mistake. She also said she would cooperate and, in fact, welcome an investigation into her actions. That wasn't enough for the people of South Korea. Their protests grew larger, louder, and after multiple weeks, showed no signs of stopping. At night, they held candles, a display of power that would come to be known as the Candlelight Revolution. And South Koreans showed up. Just one weekend, protesters in Seoul were estimated to consist of 1.3 million participants, with signs chanting, "Park Geun-hye, step down." Dissent magazine reported that when all was said and done, 16 million South Koreans hit the streets in protest across the nation. That's substantial, especially when you consider their total population at the time was only 51 million. Nearly a third of the country was in the streets, wanting the president to face justice. A few weeks later, on November 29th, with pressure reaching a boiling point, Park asked Parliament to, quote, decide how and when she could give up power. She was, as the kids say, cooked. And then Randall, not the guy who wrote the script, but the guy who reads over them, wrote next to that phrase, "Do the kids still say that?" Remember that comment I made earlier, that joke about one of the writers being 57? It seems that I found all of these people at a nursing home. The South Korean National Assembly quickly convened. On November 9th, 2016, 234 of the 300 members voted to impeach President Gun-hae. Who were the 66 people who thought otherwise? What? This included more than half of the members of her own party. Park's presidential powers and duties were suspended. Next, the Constitutional Court of Korea was required to hold hearings on whether or not to uphold the impeachment. These began in January of 2017. Despite promising earlier to comply with the prosecution, during the hearings, Park refused to answer questions and denied access to her presidential compound. Park's attorneys defended her by suggesting Park was being martyred, comparing her persecution to the unjust deaths of Jesus Christ and Socrates. You know, that's what it is. This whole time, I was sitting here hearing about Park, possible secret affair child with 40-year-old mentor and 300 dead children. I'm like, she reminds me of two historical figures, and that's who it was. It was Jesus and Socrates, of course. Her defense team even threatened that, quote, "There will be a rebellion and blood will drench the asphalt if the court were to uphold the impeachment and remove her from office." So is the defense team just threatening to kill people? They're impeaching her, and they're like, this woman, to me, everyone, this woman's Jesus. And if you don't put her back in office, I'm going to start shooting. But despite the warnings, in March of 2017, 8 out of the 8 judges upheld the impeachment. Like the U.S. Supreme Court, the South Korean president nominates Supreme Court judges. 5 of these 8 were actually nominated by Park, or through Park's words, probably by Choi, but they remained objective and impartial. They all found that Park, quote, seriously impaired the spirit of democracy and the rule of law, and concluded that the, quote, benefits of upholding the Constitution by dismissing her are overwhelming. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Park was booted from office as a complete and utter disgrace. She was stripped of her post-presidential benefits, such as a pension, state funding for an office, a chauffeur, and the right to be buried at the Seoul National Cemetery when she died. A snap election was held, and Moon Jae-in, the candidate that Park had previously beat, became South Korea's next president. That guy had to feel vindicated, right? Like, you run against this person, and then you find out it's literally a secret, council of weird religious groups, and they're letting kids die, and they have rituals in the Blue House and all that, and then you get elected. I know nothing about it, but that had to feel nice. Park Geun-hye was arrested soon after the court's ruling on March 30th. She was charged with 13 counts, including abuse of power, coercion of donations, and the sharing of state secrets. She was sentenced to 24 years in prison and fined a massive amount, 20 billion won, which equates to about 17.9 million American dollars. A separate trial found that Park also was taking tens of thousands of dollars a month from the National Intelligence Service for personal use. So she received another 8 years for this. I'm sure a lot of this was at Choi's behest, but she was also just stealing money. Aside from all the shady shaman's daughter who's influencing the office thing, that's just taking money. Choi's son Shil ended up getting 20 years in prison with a fine of about $12.5 million. This is because, over the course of President Park's term, Choi had coerced and embezzled about $60 million through the 2 nonprofits that she had been running. The scope of the scandal was unparalleled in the history of the country. Dozens of others involved in either facilitating or having benefited from the Park-Choi relationship were questioned and charged. This included several aides, a music video director who embezzled money from the culture sector, the culture minister for the blacklisting of artists, and both the chief of admissions and the former dean of Ewha University. Corporations were also under fire. 5 Samsung executives were indicted. Most notably, Lee Jae-yong, the vice chairman and heir to the tech mega conglomerate, was charged with bribery. This was for donating $36 million in return for political favors, and he was sentenced to 5 years in jail. Yeah, this got so out of control that the heir of Samsung went to jail over it. The chairman of the Retae Group, the 5th largest conglomerate in South Korea, was charged with paying upwards of $6 million in donations to Choi's foundations. He received 2.5 years in jail. The fallout was absolutely massive, but it was necessary for a country looking to reinforce its democratic principles. In 1689, John Locke, the philosopher who heavily influenced the United States founding fathers, wrote that if the powers in charge didn't obey a certain social contract, then it is essential for a functioning society to revolt against them. This is basically how America was founded. He'd be proud of the South Korean people and its government. In a story filled with darkness and shadows, what makes Park's relationship with Choi interesting are the shades of gray. For all the power and money involved, this story isn't just about greed. Park Geun-hye definitely was guilty of a lot of criminal and civil crimes. It's tough to feel bad for someone who stole an enormous amount of wealth for her and her friends, and also all the dead school kids. But at the same time, it's easy to see Park, at least at one point in her life, as a victim, in a sense. Yes, obviously she had been victim to the predatory Choi family, but she was also arguably a victim of her own father's bad parenting, while other institutions failed her at a young age and in an obviously vulnerable state. There were cries for help along the way, some from her and definitely from others, like her younger sister. Perhaps if someone had stepped up, this all could have been avoided. Then again, speaking up in a dictatorship, knowing its aftermath, can be a terrifying thing to do. It seems that Park's family history preceded her. And like I said, at some point, you have to become responsible for your own actions, especially when they lead to all this. Yeah, both of the Chois were obviously evil, but at some point, that evil becomes Park's as well. In December of 2021, then President Moon Jae-in, who was one of President Park's fiercest critics, pardoned Park and commuted her sentence after only about 4 years in the interest of, quote, national unity. Moon said he wanted to, quote, overcome unfortunate past history and join hands for the future. Now, this may be frustrating. All the bad stuff Park did, what do you mean the new guy just let her out of jail? Perhaps the outcome of some backdoor deal, or perhaps maybe Moon saw the same thing I'd mentioned, that at some point in her life, Park had to have been a victim. Maybe this all could have been prevented. That doesn't mean she is vindicated for all of the bad things that she did, but maybe while justice is important, vengeance isn't something that serves us either. Or you can think Moon's stupid and needed to leave her locked up. Up to you. As for Choi Soon-shil, the woman pulling the puppet strings from the shadows, well, she remains locked up in prison, far from influencing any more heads of state to do her bidding, which is probably for the better. After all, a jail cell's the perfect spot for someone who prefers darkness. And that'll do it for the story of South Korea's secret leader. This is such a wild case, but despite all the tragedy, I can't help but feel optimistic around it. 16 million people protesting a bad leader and actually getting something done that doesn't just affect them, but affects all the cronies who got them there in the first place, and people actually getting jail time over this? It is rare in these stories that people pay for their crimes, let alone nearly everyone pays for their crimes. So you know what? Good on you, South Korea. I'm proud of you and your K-pop and your KCIA and your K-dogs and your K-secret government religious cult rings. Yeah, I think this is such a fascinating tale and one with a happy note at the end. Perhaps for all the wrongdoing, some justice has been served in some small way, and it just took some show ponies to get it done. And hopefully you enjoyed as well, and I think that's great, and I just want to say thank you for watching. I heard about the story a little bit while it was happening, but I admittedly never looked that much into it, and I'm so glad we did now. This is so weird that it happened a decade ago. Man, 2016 is a decade ago. If Rasputin was in the 1910s and this happened in the 2010s, that means in the 2110s, some other country's going to have an obscure religious leader secretly control the government from the shadows. Maybe it'll be my grandkid. That'd be cool. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I'm glad we got to learn about this together. All of the people who made this video possible, even the old ones who I made fun of earlier, will be credited in the description. Be sure to show them some love, especially the writer and researcher. They did great jobs on this. Stay tuned for new uploads Mondays at noon, but for now I believe that should do it. But before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! You know, if there were any ponies on the island, I bet there's a paper trail someone should check.